Hello, my name's Nita Harding and I'm going to talk today to you about some biosecurity guidelines for veterinarians and field technicians. And I've called this module Keeping the Bugs at Bay because, as you will see, I'm talking about things that can be done to reduce the risk of new bugs arriving on farm. So I'm going to start with some introductions, then I'm going to cover off an overview of biosecurity in New Zealand, talk a little bit about on-farm biosecurity, and then talk about some tips and hints for veterinarians and field technicians with regard to biosecurity. Right, so I work for DairyNZ. I'm a veterinarian and my main areas are worker animal health, welfare and biosecurity. My role is actually that of a policy advisor, covering those particular areas for the organisation. I have a degree of experience in the primary sector within New Zealand. I've worked in the meat industry, I've worked with live animal import and export certification and quarantine, done quite a bit of auditing, I've worked in TB disease control and now of course in the dairy industry. So just a little bit about DairyNZ, for those of you who have not had much to do with the organisation. We are what's called an industry good organisation, and we're funded by a levy that is collected from all farmers that supply milk for processing. And our task is to do things for farmers that they couldn't individually do themselves. So we're probably best known for the work that we do in scientific research on a number of aspects of farm management, dairy cow health, and environmental concerns. We also do a lot of extension work with farmers, so some of you will be familiar with the discussion groups and so on that we run with farmers. We produce resources to help farmers with all sorts of aspects of farm management. These are based on the science work that is done, and we also have a policy and advocacy role for farmers, so making sure that their voice is heard in the rule setting process both with government and local government, and making sure that changes that are to be implemented are practical and doable and will actually achieve what's intended in an on-farm setting. So what I wanted to cover off a bit now was New Zealand's biosecurity system. And I think it's important to understand how this works to get a context for on-farm biosecurity. So I look at this as a layer of sieves, and each sieve reduces the risk somewhat. And this starts with work that's done in what we call the pre-border area. So this is making sure that the goods that come to New Zealand meet the requirements for importation into New Zealand. And these are covered by things called import health standards that are managed by MPI. And these set the rules for things like the kind of testing the product might need, maybe the packaging for the product, and possibly specific sources of the product, so that it minimises the risk of something being introduced to New Zealand with that product that we don't want. The next step in the process is the border inspection. So everything that comes into New Zealand, of course, comes across the border. And goods that come, containers that arrive, mail that arrives, are all inspected to make sure that as much as possible they're not containing anything that we don't particularly want. And included in that border inspection, of course, is arriving passengers. And you will have all been through Auckland Airport and had to declare that you didn't have any fruit, and some of you may have had your bags inspected for various things. It's all done to reduce the risk of something arriving in New Zealand that we don't want. Once things are cleared for entry into New Zealand, and some stuff does actually need specific quarantine before it is cleared for entry, we have some systems in New Zealand which we implement to help reduce the risk of something becoming established here. And the first of those are surveillance programs. So we do some specific testing and monitoring for things that we don't want. So fruit fly traps and fruit trees are one of those surveillance measures. We also do some testing of animals in certain parts of the country to make sure that they haven't developed antibodies to something new that we don't want. And we also do a fair bit of preparation work. So making sure that we are in a state where we can respond to something if need be. So preparation work includes things like having appropriate diagnostic tests available in laboratories, having an MPI laboratory to start with, and also having various plans in place so that if we do need to do something such as implement movement control, we have a plan to do that. We're not inventing it on the go. If we do identify something unwanted in New Zealand, we end up in a response phase. So we're doing that at the moment for Mycoplasma bovis, but we've done it for a raft of other things that you will probably be familiar with. Things like fruit fly, myrtle rust, PSA have all been subject to response plans. The aim of a response plan is to identify where the organism is, to contain it and to eradicate it. Now, we're not always successful in eradicating new things, and PSA would be a good example of that. And if we get to the point where it's not going to be possible to eradicate something, then we put in place a management plan of some sort. So PSA is a good example of something which now is undergoing a management plan so that it is contained and managed within that particular industry. So all of these things are designed to reduce the risk and to help us manage anything unwanted that might come into the country. So we do have some biosecurity challenges to deal with, and the first of those is increasing trade. So the number of containers that arrive in New Zealand with goods has gone up quite significantly over recent years. We're certainly seeing more passengers arrive in New Zealand than we're used to, and mail items in particular, a number of those have increased significantly. So every time something crosses the border, there is an element of risk. So that becomes a challenge for managing biosecurity. We also have another challenge in terms of the people that live in New Zealand. We've got over 200 different ethnic groups in the country, and these people speak in excess of 150 different languages. So you can see immediately that communication can be an issue and needs to be managed. But the other thing is these people come from different cultural backgrounds, so don't always understand the significance of good biosecurity to New Zealand. We're getting an increasing number of new threats to our biosecurity system. We're seeing new things within New Zealand, but particularly seeing new things overseas as well. This might be new animal diseases, new plant pests, or possibly microorganisms such as bacteria or fungi. We need to be aware of these emerging risks so that we can put the appropriate precautions in place to minimise the chance of these coming to New Zealand. Then the other thing we need to consider is climate change. As our climate gets warmer, there is more chance of something being established here which would normally be a subtropical species, particularly talking about some of the vectors that transmit disease in these areas. And if Northland gets warmer, we could potentially have some of these establish in the country and therefore have to manage the biosecurity risk from these things. Of course, if the whole country gets a little bit warmer, some of the things that we don't see in the South Island or the south of the South Island that are endemic in other parts of the country could become important there as well. To help with managing the challenges to biosecurity, we have a program called Biosecurity 2025, which has been established by the government but also has significant input from a wide range of stakeholder groups. So this program is looking at several aspects of work which will help improve our biosecurity preparedness and response within New Zealand and the awareness of people. The first element of this program is a team of 4.7 million. So this is about getting every New Zealander to understand how important biosecurity is, that it impacts everybody, not just the primary industries, and that we all have a role to play in protecting our country from anything unwanted. The second element is a toolbox for tomorrow. So this is looking at the things that we need or that would be helpful to improve biosecurity in New Zealand in the future. So this could be things such as new and advanced laboratory diagnostic tests. It could be methods of surveillance. It could be means of eradicating things that we don't want, such as pest control programs. The third element of this program is about information management. Data is collected in an enormous number of places by all sorts of people on things that are relevant for biosecurity. So how do we get all this data interconnected so that we can make more use of it, and in particular as an early warning system? Then there's effective leadership and governance. Now this is not just for the government, but it's for all industries that are involved in biosecurity. So how do our commercial industries incorporate biosecurity in their day-to-day work and understand the importance of it? There's a lot of things that a number of industries could do, and some are perhaps at more risk than others. For example, the transport industry, shifting containers around that are newly arrived in the country. What are they doing to ensure that they are adequately managing any biosecurity risks? And then there's looking at the skills and assets that we need in the future, in 5 years, 10 years or 20 years' time. What sort of training do we need to provide to people who are coming into the workforce so they can work effectively in the biosecurity area? And are there any assets we need to look at investing in so that we're best placed to manage biosecurity in the years to come? So I'd like to talk a little bit about on-farm biosecurity now. And I like to think of farms as islands with a boundary fence as a border, a bit like New Zealand as an island with a border. If we can think of each farm as an individual unit with its own border, and what are we doing to manage what comes across the border? So I think about biosecurity as a set of preventative measures. So these are designed to reduce the risk of the transmission of diseases, but not only animal diseases, also pests and weeds, because they can impact on farm productivity, and thinking about the transmission of these to livestock. So of course we're talking about animal health, but to people, some of the things of concern are zoonotic diseases, and also to crops and pasture on farm, because all of these things can impact on farm productivity. So the focus is wider than just animals, it's plants and pests as well. So if we talk about the principles of biosecurity, we're talking about separation. So if something doesn't need to come on farm, keep it off, and that applies to equipment and to people. And then cleaning, removing visible contamination of things, whatever they might be, and then disinfection. Remembering, of course, that disinfectants don't work through dirt, so it's important that things are cleaned before they're disinfected. We're encouraging farmers to control who and what comes onto their farm, thinking about that as the risk that these people or items might pose to the farm, and also to make sure that farm staff are aware of farmer requirements and the procedures that take place on that particular farm. Associated with that, of course, is making sure visitors are aware, so signage for visitors, so that they understand the biosecurity requirements for entering that particular property. To help farmers do this, we've developed something called the Biosecurity Warrant of Fitness. Now this was developed with input from veterinarians and farmers in South Canterbury because they were concerned about the implications of the Mycoplasma bovis outbreak to the biosecurity of their own farms. So the Biosecurity Warrant of Fitness covers off 5 elements which have been designed to pick up the key things for farms. So stock movements, access to the farm layout, staff awareness, and finally an action plan to put into place the things that will make a difference to that particular farm. So the key points in the Biosecurity Warrant of Fitness are encouraging farmers to do pre-purchase checks when they're buying or leasing animals, so that they understand the health status of animals that are coming on farm and what risk they may pose to animals that are already on farm. Encouraging farmers to keep animals separate from the herd, essentially in quarantine for at least 7 days when they arrive on farm, so that they can check the animal health status, and if there are any concerns, check these out before animals are mixed with the herd. This might be the only opportunity to prevent something new becoming established in the herd. We're also encouraging farmers to define risk areas on farm. Obviously on all farms there are different areas, some areas where visitors can freely come and go, and other areas where you really would like to keep visitors to an absolute minimum. So thinking about risk areas and how visitor access is managed to those areas and what the requirements might be for moving between areas. So in particular, thinking about visitor areas as possibly green zones where people can reasonably freely come and go. Then maybe having a blue or amber zone where there is some risk and you want to have some control over visitors, and this might perhaps be the quarantine paddock or the stockyards where animals arrive and leave the farm. And then having a red zone where animals are kept and you really want to minimise visitor access as much as possible. So areas where the herd grazes, and I would put calf pens in that area as well, managing access to those areas to minimise the risk of something being introduced to the animals and being spread, and how you might control access and what the requirements might be for moving into those areas. Boundary fences, of course, are important. They are the farm border, so ensuring these are complete and secure. Having a clean on, clean off concept, so making sure that people, when they arrive, are clean, so they haven't brought something from another farm, and then cleaning before they leave, so that whatever they've picked up on the farm, they leave behind and they're clean for the next farm. Ensuring that NATE records are completed for animal movements, and that these are done in a timely manner, because this certainly helps with tracing animals. And remembering, of course, that some of these things may entail some changes on farm. Some things will be reasonably quick and simple, maybe free or cheap to implement, but other things farmers will want to think a little bit more deeply about. Thinking particularly about how animals being grazed off the farm are managed, where do they go, who they're mixed with, what are the requirements for looking after those animals, and how much risk will they pose when they return to the farm. Service bulls are another area that farmers may want to think about. Where do they source these bulls from? How long do they keep them? And where do they go when they're finished with them? Changing those sorts of systems will probably take a bit of time and a bit of thought on an individual farm basis. So in terms of clean on, clean off, if we talk about the equipment that is used, particularly if equipment is used on animals, and especially if equipment is used inside animals, so things such as drenching equipment or AI equipment, this should all be cleaned and thoroughly disinfected between farms. Some farmers are even choosing to do this between mobs on farms. And in particular, if farmers are sharing things between farms, maybe they share drenching equipment with their neighbour, then making sure that that is disinfected between properties is important. Equipment that is not used on animals, if it is clean, so free of any visible contamination and dry, you will have removed most of the risk of transmitting animal diseases. There's nothing for the bugs to hide in if things are clean, and if they're dry, then desiccation will probably remove most of the rest of the risk. Personal protective equipment should be cleaned and disinfected between farms, so I'm talking about things like boots, aprons, gloves. Wherever possible, if disposable can be used, that would be better, and then it can be clean for the farm and then left on the farm when you leave, and you're not risking taking something to another farm. We get a lot of questions about machinery that comes on farm. It's important that such machinery doesn't contact animals. Animals can be curious, they can slobber over things, so keep animals away from the machinery. And in general, this is lower risk for transmission of disease, provided it is free of mud and fecal material. Equipment that's used for harvesting may pose some risk from weed seeds, but contractors are generally getting good at assessing what that risk is and appropriately treating their equipment between farms. So this poster has been developed with input from MPI, DairyNZ and NZVA to help remind farmers about biosecurity principles, the separation, keeping things off that don't need to come on farm, cleaning things properly and then disinfecting. You might find this useful to have some copies of this poster to provide to farmer clients and to be able to talk through this process with them. Right, now let's talk a little bit about biosecurity for Mycoplasma bovis, because we get asked a lot of questions about this. I see this as a subset of on-farm biosecurity. On-farm biosecurity needs to cover animal disease, weeds and pests. Mycoplasma bovis is a specific organism that we're trying to minimise the risk of being spread between farms. So there's some particular things to consider for Mycoplasma bovis. First of all, the main way this disease spreads is by the movement of infected animals. So it's particularly important that if farmers are sourcing animals, they find out where the animals are coming from, and not just that particular last movement prior to coming to the farm, but the previous history of those animals as well. This will give an idea of who these animals may have been mixed with and how many different herds that might involve, and therefore the degree of risk. Also, asking some questions about the health history of the animals, and in particular things that may be a concern for Mycoplasma bovis, such as mastitis and possibly calf hood illnesses. And of course, ensuring that the NATE records are completed for those animals in a timely manner, and that includes making sure the animals are properly identified. Prevention of close animal-to-animal contact is important for reducing the risk of spread of Mycoplasma bovis. So thinking about where animals may have possibly been in contact with other animals is important. Maybe sharing a truck could be significant, or possibly passing through sale yards. The other way that Mycoplasma bovis is spread is by feeding milk from infected cows to calves without any treatment. So we are advising that if calves are being fed milk that is sourced from another farm, where the degree of risk may not be well understood, then that milk is treated before it is fed to calves. So treatment can be either pasteurisation or acidification, and that will significantly reduce any risk of transmitting Mycoplasma bovis via the feeding of milk to calves. The other thing, of course, with Mycoplasma bovis is boundary fences. Mixing stock is a risk, so making sure boundary fences are complete and secure to minimise the risk of animals mixing from different herds by being able to cross a boundary fence. So how do we get farmers interested in biosecurity? It's a challenge we've thought about, and we've taken an approach of talking to farmers about the value of implementing biosecurity precautions. Talking about this as a risk management process to protect their business interests. Most farms are multi-million-dollar enterprises. It makes sense to have some risk management strategies in place to protect that business investment. And I liken this to taking out an insurance policy, or maybe implementing a vaccination program against a particular disease. These are risk management strategies. There's some cost up front, but it's to protect the business in the future against something unexpected. Biosecurity is no different. The other thing is that farmers need to make sure they understand they have to do some stuff for themselves. This is not something somebody else can entirely do for them. Farmers need to take a responsibility and look at what's important for their farm and implement some biosecurity precautions on their own farm. If every farmer did this, the industry would be more resilient. We all know that we've got a well-protected population against a particular disease because vaccination levels are high. If we do get an outbreak of the disease, it doesn't last for long. Biosecurity is no different. And it's also important that people who work with farmers understand and respect the biosecurity requirements for the farmers they work with. So all sorts of service providers, whether they be the veterinarians, whether it's some sort of contractor who comes on farm, whether it's an AI technician, whether it's a real estate agent, all understanding that they have a role to play in helping to protect their farmer clients' farms in terms of biosecurity precautions. So in terms of what these sorts of advisors can do with regard to biosecurity and make sure they're best prepared, there are a number of suggestions. And the first of those is to be aware. Understand the biosecurity system and know the current issues so that you can take some sensible precautions, and you can also talk to farmers about what you're doing. Consistent messaging around biosecurity is important. There's nothing worse than farmers getting a different message about the same thing from different people. It's very confusing, and in the end they probably do nothing. So use the resources that have been prepared there's a lot of biosecurity resources available. The MPI website, DairyNZ website, Beef and Lamb website, and use those as a basis of the messaging to farmers about biosecurity, because they'll be familiar messages for farmers. It'll save you a bit of work, and we've got consistent messaging for farmers to help with biosecurity management. Walk the talk, and I'm going to talk about this several times, I think. Make sure that you practice good biosecurity procedures when you visit farms. Actions speak louder than words. And remember that you're part of the team of 4.7 million, just like everybody else in New Zealand. So understanding the role that you have, what you can play, what you can do, and how you can contribute to biosecurity preparedness and awareness in New Zealand. In terms of the particular roles for veterinarians and field technicians, you are the animal health experts. So you're seen as the go-to people, particularly when dealing with animal health issues. So talk to farmers about the biosecurity warrant of fitness. See if they know it exists. There are plenty of tips and hints in there. Work through those with farmers. You'll be able to guide them as to which are the most important for their farm and their circumstances. Talk to farmers about pre-purchase checks for animals. You will understand the particular health issues on that farm and what's the most important thing for farmers to check when they're thinking about buying or leasing animals. If farmers approach you with concerns about newly arrived animals, take those seriously. As I said before, this may be the only opportunity to prevent something new becoming widespread in the herd. Do the checks and talk to farmers if they have some concerns about these animals. You're also a contact point if farmers see something unusual. We advise farmers to talk to their veterinarian if they see something that they don't like the look of in their herd, and to do that in a timely fashion. So if you do get a call from a farmer, take it seriously and follow it up. It may be the first sign of something new in New Zealand. And of course, demonstrating good biosecurity. What you do is what will be seen as the standard that needs to be applied on farm. There are some practical steps you can do to help with this. Become a recipient of the MPI stakeholder updates. You can get on emailing lists, or maybe the clinic could be on the emailing list, so that you're kept up to date with what's going on in the biosecurity area. These come out regularly for Mycoplasma bovis, but there's also stakeholder updates for other developments in the biosecurity area as well. Understand the health status of particular properties. You can talk this through with farmers, you can check records, because then you know what the risks are for that particular farm. Talk to farmers, have biosecurity conversations with them. The more conversations that we can have about biosecurity, the more aware farmers become. Make it easy to practice good biosecurity. Have a cleaning kit in your vehicle. If you're going somewhere where there isn't water, take some water so that you can also clean up before you leave. So just thinking ahead about how you might be able to demonstrate this good biosecurity. And have some plans for emergencies. What's going to happen if there's an adverse event? Is there any particular advice that you might be giving farmers? Is there anything that you might be able to do to lessen the biosecurity impact of unexpected things? So the most important phone number to remember is this one here. This is the Exotic Disease Hotline for MPI. Make sure you keep this number handy, have it in the clinic and have it in your vehicles. If you see anything of concern, please do call this number. MPI would far rather have 1,000 calls that amount to nothing, as long as they don't miss the important call. So this is the number that you must have available, and you could also make sure that farmers are aware of this number as well. So just to quickly summarise what I've covered off today, biosecurity is risk management. If you can look at it as a series of processes where we reduce the risk of something new arriving, and each step is an important part of the process. Everyone has a role to play. This is not just for vets and not just for farmers, this is for everybody. So lots of good biosecurity conversations are great. Treat each farm as an island, and every time you enter, you are crossing a border. So if you can take that kind of approach, then it reminds both you and everybody else that there are some precautions to take as you go onto a farm. Veterinarians and field technicians have a role as advisors and also to set an example. Remember, you are being seen as the people who set the standard for biosecurity. And times are changing. We've had a lot more conversations about biosecurity over recent times. Make sure you talk to farmers about biosecurity. These are vital conversations. And I think veterinarians and field technicians also have a role to lead farmers through some of these changes. Some of them are going to require some farm system changes. And it's important that this is done in a measured way and that they will actually achieve what the expected outcome is. So this is an important process and important for everybody to play a role in biosecurity and work together to achieve a more resilient industry that in the long run will be better for both the farmers and for New Zealand.
Many thanks go to Nita from DairyNZ for her time and expertise. We hope you found that a really interesting and informative vet space module to do, and you're reminded of the bigger biosecurity picture when you're next cleaning your boots on farm. There's now a short quiz to complete to reinforce your learning on the importance of biosecurity, and thanks very much for watching this vet space module.